Okay, as I mentioned the other day, I've been kind of under the weather, which means I got a lot of reading done. So I'm going to break it up into a couple videos and try and get caught up here in the middle of Rocket Summer, which are people doing it? Let me know in the comments if you're doing it because it doesn't seem like I don't feel like I'm seeing many videos about it this year. And I feel in general like some of the events I followed over the years are a little off. Maybe people are busy. Maybe they're sweating to death in the United States and the United Kingdom. Okay, I'm not going to worry about that. All right, so I've been doing them week by week. I did the 30s and prior. I think the stuff I did was in the 20s and 30s. And the second week is supposed to be 1940s. The third week is the 50s, and the final week is the 60s. This is, of course, Michael K. Vaughan's event. Rocket Summer every July. Pick out books or short stories from all those decades and really get enjoying classic sci-fi. I found a problem. I found a glitch in the Matrix. That's just an exaggeration, of course, but there are, and I think people who read old science fiction are pretty aware of this. There is a genre of science fiction novel, subgenre of science fiction novel called the fix-up. And many of the greatest books in science fiction are fix-up novels. And what that is officially is a book that appeared as individual short stories that are connected in somehow that are then later put together into a book, not as a collection of short stories, but as a quasi novel, like an episodic novel. A picaresque novel, if we want to invoke Don Quixote, or why not? Anyway, come to find out, according to Wikipedia and other sources, this term fix-up was invented by none other than A.E. Van Vogt, who was also the king of the fix-ups. And so I read this book, which includes his first published short story, Black Destroyer, his second published short story a couple months later in Astounding. They're both, or no, I'm sorry, Black Destroyer was in Astounding. I think the second one was in a different. Then in 1943, he wrote another story about the voyage of the same spacecraft, the Space Beagle. And finally, in 1950, he wrote a fourth story, which appears second in the collection. I'm really overloading you with meaningless trivia. And was written and published in a magazine, I think Astounding again, in 1950, the year that the novel came out. So what I'm trying to get at is this was probably never originally conceived as unlike, say, Lana of Cathal by Burroughs, where he wrote four novelettes in four consecutive issues of Amazing, with the intention that he would put them all in one book and they would be collected. But what a true fix-up is, in my opinion, and why would you want any other opinion, is a group of short stories that were not originally intended as a novel. And sometimes they're rewritten to some extent or another. I believe there's some extra chapters in here. So in view of all that, I decided I'm going to talk about three books that I read over the last couple of weeks that don't fit into one decade or another. Because, like I said, this is two stories from 39, one from 43, and the final one from 1950. But it is and two of the books I'm going to talk about I loved a lot. This is my favorite of the three. And then at the end, I'll talk about one I didn't like at all, even though it's a writer I like. And then I'll discuss whether it's a fix-up or not. I am not the biggest A.E. Van Vogt reader. I want to read more. I read probably post-high school when I was reading a lot of science fiction just out of high school. I read The World of Null A, it's a book allegedly about a person who goes into another dimension or something, which is based on a non-Aristotelian logic. I read this book. I really couldn't tell what difference Aristotelian or non-Aristotelian logic meant. I still don't know. I kind of looked it up. it's apparently using intuition or something instead of mathematical logic. Anyway, it just was not my kind of thing. And to my shame, I am also, and then I believe I read the first story in this Black Destroyer once before, when it was in some anthology. It's famous. That story and one other story, you put them together, are famously very similar to the movie Alien, I guess, kind of. He did get some money out of the producers for it, though. He settled out of court and got $50,000 from the producers of Alien. They just paid him off because, you know, it's Hollywood. They got a lot of money. I really didn't think they need to. But, you know, it was frustrating for writers of this era, comic book writers and science fiction writers, especially, to see kind of these concepts that they had pioneered back in the 30s and 40s just all over Hollywood, you know, starting with Star Trek. You know, nobody ever sued Star Trek, I don't think, but this book is clearly a very strong influence on Star Trek. It's about a very large starship with about 1,000 men on it, no women, which is significant for a couple reasons. And to be generous to Van Vogt, I think he just made an assumption. This is right before World War II. There was aircraft carriers that would have, according to my dad, aircraft carriers. When he was in the military in the 50s, had like 5,000 people on them. I don't know if they're bigger or smaller now, you know, or crews of submarines or whatever on long voyages. This is a long voyage, you know, and if you look at the original Beagle, the title is a play on the Voyage of the Beagle, the Charles Darwin novel about his 5-year expedition. That included stops in the Galapagos and stuff. That's on my list to read. Haven't got to it, but someday. Those were all male crews, and I believe he just made the assumption that that would be the same thing in the future. And this is also a 5-year mission. Is it? I think it's a long-term space expedition, so to seek out new worlds and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before. It's very Star Trek, very Fantastic Planet. Not Fantastic Planet. Is that the name of that movie from the Forbidden Planet? Um, so so there's about 1,000 people, 999 guys on this ship. I don't know what they're all doing. I don't know. I think it's mostly different science departments, you know, and there is some military presence, and there is some, of course, people that are required to run the ship. And they're all being fed, you know, with their own knowledge and stuff, that it's not a secret or anything, like some kind of super saltpeter that suppresses their sexual drives, but does not, you know, since they've got this like baked in, we can't have any ladies in the cosmos, which might have caused other problems based on Van Vogt's vision of deep space exploration. But anyway, so they're not having sex. They don't have sexual desires. I guess there's no long-term effects to this. It seems like a pretty bad way to try and, you know, keep control of a population. But anyway, nobody seems to try and get around it or anything. But they do feel the loss of women. They do feel the loss of any kind of normal society. And what's interesting about this book, in addition to the stories, which are almost like cosmic horror, they meet these aliens, which are highly intelligent, very hungry, very weird. You know, there's one creature in one of the episodes that is lives like between the cosmos. They all seem to be, you know, there's just three that stories particularly that deal with really disturbing hostile alien monsters. And they're slowly going nuts. This whole crew is slowly going insane. In fact, I believe it's the end of the third story. if they defeat this really insane, almost Lovecraftian type creature, which more superstitious people would think of as demons or gods. I mean, more superstitious than the crew of this, all these biologists and stuff. They go to different planets, they discover dying civilizations, things like that. What was I saying? They're going nuts. Oh, so at the end of I think it's the third story. There's one scientist who's the main uh, character in the book. In each story, he's the main protagonist of figuring things out, figuring how they're going to defeat these creatures. Um, I'll go into him more in a minute, but someone else says to him, I'm a much worse human being now than when we started this mission, because they're going nuts, because they're meeting such strange apocalyptic creatures. They see how hostile space and how lonely space is. And I found that very compelling. I don't know why he didn't write more stories. Maybe he wrote some series. I guess he was just. I think he could have done more with the series. Although some of the plots of the first and third stories are pretty similar. I believe the third story is the first one he wrote. He wrote it and sent it to John Campbell at Astounding. It was rejected, but it was also inspired by Who Goes There. John Campbell's classic story, which was made into a movie, The Thing, or the various movies called The Thing. They said try again, so he wrote a similar story, which was Black Destroyer, which was his first published story. Then he revised the third story and sold it, I think, to a secondary magazine. I'm going to have to speed up here because I'm only on the first book, but he's a great writer. I started to say I'm very ashamed that I gave this writer short shrift, because I happened to read his whole entire Wikipedia page when I was reading it, because I just found his life very fascinating. There's a lot of fascinating elements to it. He was a very important writer early on. He's a huge influence on Philip K. Dick. But in around the early 50s, he got savaged in a review by what's that guy's name? Damon Knight. And it really hurt his reputation, according to everything I've read. And he was considered really like, even when I started reading science fiction in the 70s, he was considered kind of a hack, a really bad writer, kind of example of bad writing. His writing is not bad at all. He is a much better line by line prose writer, for example, than Doc Edison, which I recently read, who's also not bad. But he's and Philip K. Dick was a contrarian to that, but saying that Van Vogt was one of his major inspirations. I believe Delaney liked him too, or someone else. So it took him a while to get his reputation back. A couple things that I think also worked against him were he was associated with Dianetics, which is the precursor to Scientology. A lot of these astounding writers, it was really weird culty stuff. John Campbell was into it. It wasn't just L. Ron Hubbard who invented it and published Dianetics originally in Astounding, and people wrote in and they thought it was a joke and sometimes, because Astounding would also do these kind of these kind of humorous pseudo speculative articles that were fiction, but were and people actually thought that the Dianetics was one of those things. L. Ron Hubbard was a big writer for the magazine, big fiction writer for the magazine, although he started out writing just general pulp, not science fiction, but he's the kind of guy, there's a few of these people coming up that just can write in pretty much any genre. Anyway, A. Van Vogt was so into Dianetics as opposed to Scientology, we'll get to that in a second, that he was the director, that he stopped writing in the 50s, and he was, for a decade, he was the director of the Dianetics Center in Los Angeles. when L. Ron Hubbard decided, there wasn't enough money in science fiction, so he wrote Dianetics. Then he decided there was a lot of money in self help, but there was even more money in religion. So he took his ideas from Dianetics and started building Scientology and building a cult around it. A. Van Vogt was not into that at all, so he broke with them. But he still worked for Dianetics for a while, but he did not. He was not on board with a religion, a new religion based on these techniques. So he went back to writing eventually in the 60s. Damon Knight, meanwhile, was a very important figure in the 50s and the 60s. And just from what I know about science fiction, just from being a fan for a long time and just having read, the Locus magazine and stuff kind of religiously in the 70s and going to a couple conventions and stuff, I have to say that just science fiction can be a very cliquish community and can be very there's a high school element, there's an in crowd and an out crowd and that kind of thing. And Damon Knight was very important as a critic and as an editor. He had a very prestigious anthology series, and if people wanted to be published in that anthology series, they probably wanted to stay on his good side. But anyway, it's kind of absurd to think about it. And the community was very small then. And there was kind of an effort to make things over, to become literary, quote unquote, in science fiction, with the new authors that started coming in the 60s, in the 50s, and became prominent in the 60s. This would be like Silverberg and Ellison and different people who wanted more literary standards. Although I would argue that A. Van Vogt is a very literate writer. From what I've read, and again, it's not very much, but this is his earliest stuff, and I think his writing is excellent. It's very evocative. So he kind of became the scapegoat for the old guard. He didn't sell enough, like Heinlein or Clark or Asimov, in 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 such great numbers that he couldn't be ignored. So it's kind of unfortunate, and I went along with that as a reader, thinking there wasn't much there. He was kind of old fashioned, out of date, but seen a couple great videos by Grammaticus and by Outlaw Bookseller, both about the weapons shop stories. And those are two really intelligent, astute YouTuber critics of science fiction. So I think there's more there than I ever gave Van Vogt credit for. So I'm going to definitely read more. Going back to the fix-up thing, I guess I don't think I'm going to get to the others. I'll talk about him real quickly at the end. He was not only the inventor of the fix-up, or at least the person who gave it its name, he was also kind of an abuser of it. He was criticized sometimes for fixing up a collection of a group of short stories that were very tangentially related and trying to present them as a novel. Don't know if that's true because I haven't read much of that, but anyway, he's definitely one of my new favorites people I want to continue. There's just another cover. Anyway, so real quickly, I'll talk about the other two books. The first one is another fix-up, Adam Link. You can find them now, Eando Binder, Adam Link Robot. This is from Wildside Press. It's $2.99. Most Wildside Press books are 99 cents. So hopefully there's a little more money here to go to Eando Binders. Relatives, Adam Link Robot. The first story is famously called I, Robot. To anyone fond of the robot story in science fiction, Adam Link is of extraordinary interest. The robot with emotion has rarely been handled so well by Isaac Asimov. The earliest couple stories were written in the 30s. The rest were written in the 40s. So it's along with this thing. It spans the decades, although not as broadly as Voyage of the Space Beagle. It's a terrific read. I read this so fast. I think it's about 12 stories, 10 stories, 12 stories. He is a mechanical man who is made by a scientist who then dies in an accident that he is blamed for. Actually, he dies in an accident, so Adam Link decides to go out into the world and immediately is treated like the Frankenstein monster, which unfortunately he had not read at this time. He goes back to the house. He does find a copy of Frankenstein, and that's kind of a guidebook, as well as an inspiration for the stories of how he kind of moves in the world. Although in the stories he progresses towards human rights, he is befriended by the nephew of of his um, of his inventor. Starts out very common kind of trope for the late 1920s, early 1930s of a guy working alone who creates a robot, creates an invention, uh, along the lines of the Skylark books. This was really a common thread back then. Based on really the whole history of scientific progress in the West, when it was really done mostly not by institutions but by individuals. You think of Isaac Newton or Einstein, who worked at a patent office, or individual Charles Darwin, who had, and along as with Isaac Newton, had independent funds, independent wealth that allowed them to devote their lives to science, as opposed to now where it's all institutional. So it's very common to have a story with just a lone scientist who invents like an impossibly advanced robot, which has perfect human intelligence, artificial intelligence, whatever you want to call it. And he grows throughout the book, and it is just really a fun read. It progresses in a series of adventures that really essentially are one story by the time it ends, and I can't recommend it enough. Here's the cover for it. These all appeared amazing. This is Adam Link's Vengeance, which I think is probably the second story. First story was called I, Robot, which was later taken as the title for Asimov's story collection. I think there's 8 or 10 stories in here. He says he objected to this. Isaac Asimov did. So apparently he had no power over what his book publisher, which he submitted to this, was going to call the book. But he is always one to give credit to Eando Binder for these Adam Link stories, which did inspire him. So my problem with so this is the third book I'm going to talk about. Just talk about it for a minute or so. I really did not like this book at all, and I thought first of all, there's no reason to call it iRobot because there's nothing from a robot's point of view. Maybe the last couple of stories kind of have a robot's point of view, a robot. I just found the stories really dull and pedantic. There's mostly just trying to work out the stories, the laws of robotics. And first story, there's a it's called Robbie. It's a playmate. The robot is a playmate for a child. It doesn't really go anywhere. And then there's a few stories about they use robots for mining, and there's other stories where the robots are more intelligent. Eventually, by the end, spoiler alert, the robots are running the human civilization. Excuse me, which makes sense because their artificial intelligence, as the billionaires are trying to explain to us today, will eventually surpass human intelligence, and then naturally they will run things. However, I don't believe that the AI we're seeing today really is real artificial intelligence. But this is fiction, so he can do that in there. I just found the stories very flat and uninteresting, and I like Asimov. I love the Foundation books. I love a lot of his later stories. The story that I really like a lot. Maybe I'll reread it again uh, for something. called The Last Answer. Not The Last Question, which is a good story, but The Last Answer, which is really a story with a lot of philosophical implications. I like his humorous stories. I like his later work a lot. I just really, this just turned me off. It just seems so dry, and this is kind of a fix-up. I mean, you can tell these are individual stories. They don't have continuing characters for the most part. There's a kind of wraparound device, though, of this journalist interviewing Susan Calvin, who's a robotics scientist who has something to do with some of the stories and that. But I really feel like it almost doesn't qualify as a. It's really a short story collection with a gimmick of a wraparound. I would not call it a true fix-up. It was what I think it read more like what people expect if they haven't read old sci-fi. It's what they expect it to sound like, what they expect it to be like. Characters that are just there to give scientific information, or it's pretty. It's the weakest Isaac Asimov stuff I've ever read. So, but I enjoy the Foundation series a lot. I don't know if these were running concurrently or not. He wrote a lot of other really good early stuff. Nightfall, I think, is excellent. And I don't know why this didn't do it for me, but I wanted to compare with the other two, especially Atom Link Robot by Eando Binder, which is kind of a rediscovered classic, I think. Michael K. Vaughan did a video on it. Or I watched it recently. I have no idea when he did it, because sometimes my algorithm throws me up like 5-year-old videos and I think they're new. So anyway, this is the end of this video. Okay. I'll talk to you about next. I will talk about the books that I read just for the 1940s.